Let's talk now about crossover, chart crossover, and cover versions. As I said last week, the charts that we're talking about are record industry charts, and the two organizations that get the most consideration from scholars are a magazine called Cashbox and especially the magazine called Billboard. These magazines were designed not for fans to read. They weren't like magazines like Rolling Stone or Mojo or something like that you would pick up in order to find out for a fan to find out what was happening, or interviews with their favorite artists, something like this. These were magazines that were put together to help advise people who were in the business of providing music retail or music services what music was popular and what music was not popular. So if you were somebody who had jukebox business, what you wanted when you put your records in that jukebox is you wanted to get people to put as many dimes or nickels or whatever they were put into that thing as possible. And so you want to maximize the number of plays per record you can possibly get. So what you want to know is, what do people like? What are they playing? You know, what seems like it's getting hot? What's starting to cool off? You put as many of the hot records or getting hot records into your jukebox as you can, and pull the records that are starting to cool out. And that way you can maximize your profit from each of these jukeboxes that you have in various sort of lounges and bars and this kind of thing. If you're somebody who's running a radio station, you want to play the music that everybody seems to be wanting to listen to, right? Because the more listeners you get, the more advertising you can get, the more you can charge for advertising. So you want to know what's hot on the radio, and having a magazine tell you what the national trends are and regional trends are is very, very valuable. And if you're somebody who's in record retail, you don't want to have a whole bunch of records sitting on the shelf that nobody wants anymore. You want to have records on the shelf that people are likely to buy, and so you want to sort of time your buying to what seemed like the trend, what's happening with the trends. So if you know what the trends are, if you have some suspicion, you can guess. You have a much better idea of maximizing your profit and your business in the music retailing and service than you might if you didn't. And so that's what these things were meant to do. And because of that, they were divided up into markets. And as we said before, the markets were thought of as fairly distinct and almost exclusive, not entirely, but almost exclusive of each other. So pop, as we said before, mainstream pop was considered a middle-class white audience. R&B was an urban black audience. Country and Western was a rural white audience, farming communities, or those who were displaced from such communities into urban environments. And the charts were also divided up by use. So there was a separate chart for radio, a separate chart for retail, a separate chart for jukebox in each of these designations. You kind of look up whatever your particular concern was and see what seems to be happening week by week in popular music. Now, at this point, I should say a word, or at least sort of sound a warning about using chart numbers too much. I will talk to you about chart numbers as an indication of popularity of records. And in the textbook, if you're following in the textbook, you'll see a lot of chart numbers. But you should know that chart numbers are a fairly coarse instrument for trying to figure out the popularity of a particular record. I mean, if a record goes to number 1 or number 2 or number 3 or number 4, it's probably not a big distinction there. There could be all kinds of things that account for that. But a number 20 record really is a different kind of thing than a number 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5 record, right? So at that level, when you're looking at where they place generally in a chart, it makes a lot of difference. It helps also, charts do, they help keep us from getting into the fan mentality, which is this idea that we're always rooting for the artists that we like the most and maybe neglecting those that we don't like as much. When you see the chart statistics there, sometimes it causes you to admit that some of the artists you like maybe didn't sell as many records or weren't as popular as maybe you thought they were, and it also forces you to admit the artists you don't like so much actually had a fair amount of success. So chart numbers are useful that way, but we shouldn't be too literal about them and use them to do sort of make fine distinctions that they were never designed to be able to make. Let's talk now about crossover records and crossover songs. There are really two. When we talk about crossover, that is when a tune is originally on the country chart and somehow makes it onto the pop chart, or a tune that starts on the rhythm and blues chart and makes it onto the pop chart. And that's mostly what we're talking about. I mean, when you think about it, by definition, crossover could mean anything. It could be going from country to rhythm and blues to country, or from mainstream pop back to country or whatever. But mostly it's about records from one of those two other smaller charts making it into the pop chart. When we talk about crossover, that's what we mean. And there's two ways that can happen. Either the record itself can actually cross over. So Little Richard does Tutti Frutti. It's originally on the R&B charts. Then after it plays for a while and as a hit there, it shows up on the mainstream pop charts, done by Little Richard. That's a crossover record. Same song, same artist. On the other hand, a song itself, but not the same record, can cross over. So it could be a song Tutti Frutti by Little Richard, that appears on the rhythm and blues charts, that is then covered or done in a different version by Pat Boone, and the Pat Boone record on the mainstream pop charts goes up the pop charts but doesn't chart on the R&B chart. There you see the song moves from, in the case of Tutti Frutti, both the record and the song crossed over, but there's a distinction there. So we want to keep that straight. Now, when a song crosses over like that and it's done in a different version, we often use the term cover version. And as I mentioned last week, I'm not really quite sure cover version is exactly the right term here, because people were already doing lots of different versions of songs. There are those kinds of versions usually involve putting your own personal stamp on a record. It turned out, though, during this period that there were actually cover versions that were more like duplicates. In other words, you were making a record that sounded exactly like the other record. The only difference was that you changed the lyrics so that there were no kind of sexual connotations that anybody could pick up on. And the artist was white, sometimes even like markedly white. I mean, you call a group the Crew Cuts, and you know it's probably a vocal group of white guys, right? And so this kind of thing, and this is the part where we start to go into the area of controversy and certain kinds of disputes that have broken out over this. In the record business. They come down to this controversy about whether or not there's how much racism is involved in the idea that white artists would cover the music of black artists and do better on the mainstream pop charts than the black artists themselves did. Let me tell you a little bit about the statistics and why this should be such an important consideration. In the period between 1950 and 53, about 10% of the songs that were hits on the R&B chart crossed over to the pop charts. So 1 in 10 R&B hits could cross over the pop chart. So you would say that between the R&B chart and the pop chart, that's a pretty fair amount of isolation between the two. It's not exclusive in an absolute sense, but there's a lot of isolation there. In 1954, you could see the trend. Already 25% of R&B hits are crossing over from the R&B chart to the pop charts. But by 1958, 94% of the songs that were R&B hits appeared on the mainstream pop charts. Well, if you were one of those black artists that had the original R&B record and it was a hit, boy, it would have been great if then it would have crossed the actual record with your name on it, would have gone over to the mainstream pop chart, and you would be able to have all the success, financial and otherwise, that goes with that. And to have that success taken away because somebody covers it in a version that sounds almost exactly like yours, but they get all the success, you get the thing started on the R&B chart and they take it over. Well, that was a pretty bitter pill for a lot of African American musicians to swallow. And there were all kinds of ways in which musicians were ripped off in that era as well. A lot of times, those musicians didn't even own the rights to those particular songs. The publishing rights, they signed that away when they recorded. I mean, the record company people, they did this to both black and white musicians, would say, well, what would you rather have? I'll pay you $50 for this session. I don't know what the amount was. Let's say it's $50. I'll pay you $50 for this session now, or I'll give you a certain percentage of the earnings over time. Most musicians will take their money now. They don't know whether they're ever going to see that guy in the future, right? And so when they took their money now, they signed away their publishing. So if that R&B hit crossed over, the publishers who own that music, they still made all kind of money for it, no matter who sang it, right? But the original artist only got the money they got the first time when they recorded it. And so they felt very ripped off. Now, there is a kind of a controversy surrounding this, and the biggest part of the controversy is whether or not this really is a kind of a ripping off or not. Now, you've heard the argument that comes from people like Little Richard and others who felt like they didn't get the money they should have got and they were ripped off by these white covers. The white artists have often argued that because these songs would not have been playable on radio the way they were, because the lyrics might have been a little bit too adult-themed, let's say, for mainstream pop radio. They weren't really taking it away from these people in that way. They were really sort of adapting them, and they weren't taking something away that they would have otherwise got. Well, you can decide what you think about that. But what I can tell you here is that because of the success, the crossover success of tunes like Rock Around the Clock in 1955 and Maybelline from Chuck Berry and these kinds of things, we can start to look at 1955 as really kind of being a tipping point. That's the point where all of a sudden something that had been kind of a once in a while kind of thing, this crossover thing, really starts to happen in a very big way. And so 1955, that's one of the reasons why we can look at that as the beginning of rock and roll. So let's have a look at who some of the first rock and rollers were, who they were, and what they were up to.